Hello, everyone. Thank you for attending my presentation. Really quickly, I just want to thank D'Angela and everyone who is a part of this amazing experience, everyone attending and presenting, the speakers, everyone. I'm really honored to be here. With my presentation, before we journey into this presentation, I want to say that in addition to being D'Angela's triplet, I like to identify myself as a facilitator of learning. And I would not be able to do that if I did not have amazing teachers. First and foremost, those teachers were my parents and my cousins and Prince Rogers Nelson. They were all really instrumental in helping me to shape my identity as a human being and as a Black woman. So for me, it's really important to honor this great Black man who had such a pivotal role in shaping my identity as a Black woman. Hence my presentation, Sistas in the Temple, exploring the presence of Black women in Prince's art and life. And as we journey into the presentation together, I want us to keep in mind the power of visual language and the power of the undertones of racism. We see the overtones spilling out into the streets right now, but the undertones are important to consider as well. So some background on this presentation. It's based off of a paper that I wrote that is in the Howard Journal of Communications titled Sisters in the Shadows, Examination of Prince's Strange Relationship with Black Women. And in the paper, I explore colorism as it relates to Prince, his life and his legacy. Really a confluence of factors influenced the birth of the paper, but my ultimate intent with it was to really examine and disrupt the narrative of colorism that has plagued Prince's legacy and to present a counter narrative to that a narrative of colorism, the single story that we'll talk about in a moment. And I really wanted to highlight the fact that he really loved and supported Black women of all hues in his career. So in doing all of that, what I want to do is to interrogate why this perception of Prince as a colorist, as anti-Black, particularly as anti-Black woman, persists. And so I have a few snaps here of just, if you go on message boards, YouTube, any conversation about Prince and Black women, some of these types of comments you'll see, Prince has never publicly dated a Black woman. I love Prince, but he's color struck, point blank, end of discussion. This one here at the top that says, if you were dark skinned and a Black woman, your life meant nothing to Prince at all. He hated Black women with a passion. So as we move forward, I really want us to keep these messages and questions top of mind. How many women did Prince really date publicly? What was fact? What was fiction? What did he really hate Black women with a passion? Did Black women's lives mean nothing to him? From where are we receiving these messages? Why are we receiving these messages? And then finally, how do we define the demonstration of love for Black women? So how did we get here? So like many people in 2016, when 2016 befell us, I bought every tribute magazine that was out there on Prince. And as I consumed them, I saw a disturbingly apparent trend, and that was the absence of Black women, particularly non-mixed race Black women. And so here's a snap of just a bunch of them that I had. This was the layout from the People magazine. And as you can see, the sisters aren't present. We have Sheila E., we have Alicia Keys as a muse, we have Vanity, but for the most part, we don't see a lot of Black women. And so when I look at this image, I say, where are the sisters? Because I know they were present in the whole span of his career as I followed him. So when I look at this, what is called into question is, one, Prince's culpability in creating this narrative, but then also, why is it being perpetuated to this extent? Sociologist Margaret Hunter has argued white women and men maintain their racial privilege by having their own phenotype defined as most beautiful in relation to African aesthetics. So when we see the spectacular reach of grabbing a Sherilyn Fenn or Vanessa Marcel, Susanna Hoffs, and this big picture of Kim Basinger, what visual language is being presented to us? If you can dig up Vanessa Marcel and Sherilyn Fenn, you most certainly can find Nona Gay or Shelby J or Rosie Gaines or Kat Glover. There are others who could be present. By looking at these images, we see how actively contemporary racism and colorism is or are. Margaret Hunter also said the cultural messages that give meaning and value to different skin tones are both deeply historical and actively contemporary. This is Newsweek magazine at the top. Vanity didn't even make the cut. And then we have the Women in His Life feature below. I forget which magazine this is, but again, we're seeing the same narrative. And so, as I said, we look at these images, and despite the brevity of the relationship that some of these women might have had with Prince, they're there. Colorism, or the practice of discriminating against others based on the lightness or darkness of their skin tone, has long plagued communities of color around the world. Because of the intersectionality of race and gender, Black women experience what's known as gendered colorism. And as Hunter told us, what this does is creates what she defined as the beauty queue, where the lightest are in the front, those who are white or closest to white are in the front, and the darkest are in the back, and they receive the least resources. Although here they're not even present, so I guess they're not receiving any resources. But by focusing on these women and their glaring absence of identifiably Black women, what we're seeing is the mainstream media and a lot of the independent media, online media as well, upholding hegemonic notions of feminine beauty that are centered in whiteness and this perpetuation of the misconception that Prince practiced colorism. I want to point out that Black people are not immune to this. This was a wonderful piece that Miles Marshall Lewis, who was on the previous panel, wrote for the Ebony Tribute, and he covers a lot of the sisters in the temple, but all the women who influence Prince's life in many ways. Yet the visual that accompanies it, I was struck by it because it looks like a paper bag test. Somehow Liv Warfield up at number 7 made the cut. But when you look at this, again, it looks like these women would have passed the paper bag test. Most of them are Hispanic, and this is Ebony magazine. Also, I want to point out that a young Black woman was the illustrator for this. So I can't question her artistic decisions, but what I can say is what researchers have told us is that racism, we know, can be conscious, it can be subconscious, it can be unconscious, and we know that we can internalize it. So what we want to do is to be able to interrogate what we are seeing, to understand that this racial privilege that is being promoted through the images that we see needs interrogation. It needs to be broken down. When we interrogate it, we can start to understand why Black women are being excluded and the deleterious effect that can have on the psyche of Black women. So as we call a thing, we got to call Prince out on the ways that he perpetuated, exploited, and capitulated to, notions of colorism, of white supremacy, particularly in the tan 80s that film historian Donald Bogle calls the tan 80s, this era where you had visually tan Black people, but also this idea of not disrupting this post-civil rights fantasy in America of racial harmony. And so Blackness was really in the background, and Prince, took a hold of that. This is a quote where Spike Lee pulled Prince on the carpet. He he said years earlier about colorism, which is interesting coming from Spike Lee, but that's another conversation. But Prince, when he asked Prince to speak on it, because he said Prince, set him straight, Prince said, I said one had to look at everything I have done, not just the most successful pieces. We met under different circumstances back then. I have grown and so have you. And I think this is important because it's Prince acknowledging the role he played in perpetuating the colorism narrative that has dogged him, but it's also an acknowledgement that he didn't stay there. Hunter gives us a way to understand what Prince was doing during this particular time. She has a wonderful take on it where she says, colorism is rooted in a system of white domination that rewards those who emulate whiteness culturally, ideologically, economically, and even aesthetically. We know Prince did this on his ascent to cross over to the mainstream. He made himself biracial, his mama white, Jill Jones, platinum blonde, and he surrounded himself with a mostly white band. And people have a vice grip on that era. But the reality is that as his career progressed, Prince got, as Greg Tate says, blacker and blacker. And the reality is that our identities are not fixed. It's a process. And that's the same thing that happened with Prince. We saw him grow beyond this colorism that he exploited. So when we widen the lens to look at all of the women, the Black women, the sisters who were omnipresent in Prince's life, we see that they were there from inception, starting with his mother, Maddie. And here we have Bernadette Anderson, Andre Simone's mother, who was like a second mother to him. And what I love about the Beautiful Ones book is, despite its brevity, it's really replete with an acknowledgement and gratitude of the many Black women who influenced him during his formative years. He talks about his mother. He said he could devote a chapter to Bernadette Anderson. And I love this snapshot that he had in his scrapbook of her. The other sisters who helped to shape him, Marcy, Debbie, Kari, these girlfriends, early girlfriends who he talks about in the book. I want to take a moment to bow down and praise Debbie for introducing him to what he calls draws music and the way that Black women listen to R&B ballads, their love of it, how we heard it, because we all know our lives were forever changed when the brothers started making ballads. So thank you, Debbie, for that. So let's get into Graffiti Bridge. So Graffiti Bridge is unique in that it gives us a framework for really looking at the many roles that sisters played in the temple of Prince Rogers Nelson. The first sister we have here is Jill Jones. It was great to see her last night. Looking forward to hearing more from her tonight. She's representing the lovers because in the book, in the film, she's the lover. But I don't want to reduce her to that. As we know from D'Angela Duff's great work on Jill, she was a secret weapon for him vocally. She credited or uncredited, she was singing on everything. And while other women get credit for a lot of his 80s work, she was there longer than 3 years. And she did a lot for his recording side projects, proteges. Jill was a vocal beast, and that needs to be said. But we're putting her here with the lovers for this presentation. And so thinking about visual language, let's compare this visual to what we saw earlier. This is when we talk about the lovers, friend, lover, muse, protege, wife, other. These women were also part of the Prince story, but we don't see them in these mainstream magazines. However, someone like Nona Gay was ubiquitous for about 3 years, and she was everywhere and now nowhere. We've got Kim Upshur, who Jill Jones referred to as Prince's unsung hero. Patrice Rushen, who Prince himself said was the inspiration for I Want to Be Your Lover. And I feel for you because he said he had a mad crush on her. His wife, Manuela Testolini, of course, and Vanity, who, was the prototype. Let's move into the dancers. So Robin Power, we've got her representing the dancers in the film. Robin Power, another person who for about 3 years, Graffiti Bridge, Diamonds and Pearls, the Symbol album, she was in video, she was dancing, she was out there with Diamond and Pearl, yet we see her nowhere in coverage of Prince's legacy, but she was again everywhere. more sexy dancers. We've got Kat, who was the original dancer to join his band, Damaris, his last dancer. I want to point out Monique Manning down here, who was the sister in the Kiss video. She's also one of the Glam Slam dancers in Graffiti Bridge. We've got Kimberly Arland, who was a dancer in Graffiti Bridge, also assistant choreographer. She's also in the Violet the Organ Grinder and Get Off videos. Celestina from Black Sweat and Musicology, Misty Copeland and Geneva, the twins. So a lot of sisters in the temple dancing as sexy dancers. I want to move through so D'Angela doesn't Sandman me off the stage. We've got Rosie Gaines. It's almost blasphemous for me to put Rosie in the category of musicians because vocally she was just a beast. She elevated Prince's vocals. Her singing on Diamonds and Pearls, Nothing Compares to You. It's just iconic. She was an amazing presence in the Prince catalog, but here we're representing her as the musicians because she joined the MPG in 1990 and she was a member of the band. Some other sisters who were members of Prince's band, Rhonda Smith, her name was Rhonda and she is funky, Kat Dyson, Cora Coleman Dunham, who was his drummer for years, Cassandra Cassie Keys O'Neill, who was a keyboardist, and Diallo, who was on vocals and guitar, and Sheila E., who needs no introduction because her place in the legacy of Prince's music is unparalleled, point blank, period. Just take a moment to soak up all these beautiful melanated musicians who Prince entrusted with his music, to play his music, to perform with him in the studio and on stage. On this page, I want to just shout out quickly Rashida, the DJ, and DJ Pam, the funksters as well. So he even had sisters on the ones and twos. Moving on to Mavis Staples, Miss Melody Cool. She's representing the singers, and really there's just not enough time to cover all of the ways that Black singers, Black female voices were part of Prince's legacy. However, Mavis represents the category of the legends who influenced him and whom he shared his talent and platform to help their resurgent careers. Mavis Staples, Patti LaBelle, Shaka Khan are all in that category. But then we have the sisters who were in his band, with whom he recorded, with whom he toured. Again, too many to name. Take individuals. Shelby J was with him for almost a decade. We don't see her anywhere. Bonnie Boyer was the first Black female member of the band that we saw. Sue Ann Carwell down here at the bottom, and I'm so glad Andre mentioned her. She was in the original band with Gail Chapman, but she was going to be on percussion, but then she decided to go solo. She was also going to be Prince's first protege, a local Minneapolis sister, but she went on to do her solo work. Tamar Davis, who was a protege who was with Prince everywhere, but again, nowhere now. So again, Javetta Stillo, I want to point her out because she is also in Graffiti Bridge. She's singing with the Stills Choir, and she also did recorded work with Prince as well. So again, taking in the visual. Some more visuals of sisters who he shared his stage with, not just members of his band. We've got the group Millennia, who were a protege group he worked with. We never hear about them. Ledisi, Layla Hathaway, Leanne LaHavis, Nona Gay, again, everywhere and nowhere. So again, different visual language than what we're seeing in print. Beverly Reeves, D'Angela, I'm going to need about 5 more minutes. Beverly Reeves, she represents the sisters behind the scenes. And I think this is important too, because not only did Prince share his stage with Black women, but it was his respect for the brains of Black women as well. Bevla was the assistant hairstylist who took over a lot of hairstylist duties. I would love for Jill to speak on that later tonight. But she was also in charge of wardrobe or hand-up wardrobe for the Sign of the Times and Love Sexy tours. And then we have some more sisters who were running the temple. I love this from the Beautiful Ones book, where he's explaining this concept of the feminine principle. And he says, no one can run a village like an African woman or like African women. And he really trusted these women to run his village, which was Paisley Park, and his career. So taking a moment just to look at all these amazing sisters. Debbie McGowan, the fashion designer, again, one who doesn't get as much attention, but she was his longest relationship with a fashion designer from like 1993 to 2010. So taking in these sisters who he trusted to run his village. I'll move quickly through these last few slides. Some more sisters away from his village whom he helped to just grow and expand. He was an early funder of Black Lives Matter, again, seeing the future before the rest of us. These young sisters, Coco and Breezy, these identical twins who he had designed his iconic third eye glasses. Robin Robinson, Erica Kennedy, the journalist who InStyle magazine hired when he made them hire a Black woman to interview him. I love when she said, I got drafted into the big leagues under the Prince Rogers Nelson affirmative action plan. Some more sisters who he supported and who gave homage to him for doing that. Again, important to say these sisters' names and to see their faces. I loved what King, this trio who he had opening for him for a number of shows, they said he thought it was really important for people to see young Black women making the music they wanted to make. So we see as his life progressed, it was not just about his freedom and independence, but the independence and freedom of all artists, particularly Black artists and Black women, and that needs to be said. So as I bring us to a close, I want to look at this quote from Bell Hooks, where she says, no other group in America has so had their identity socialized out of existence as have Black women. This is important because when we continue to truncate Prince's career in 1983 to 1986, or the Melvoin years, as I call them, or when we selectively pull a Carmen Electra out of the 90s, what we're doing is reinforcing this ideology that effaces Black women and their contributions from the greatest musical and artistic legacy that we have seen in our lifetimes. So I'll end with this as we look at more images of Prince and the sisters in the temple. It is difficult to identify another Black male entertainer who has matched the level of personal and financial support that Prince extended to so many Black women, publicly and privately. Milana Karenga asserted, the personal and the political are unavoidably linked. It is what we do in our daily lives that demonstrates our real views and values, and at the same time limits or increases our human possibilities. Through his actions, Prince used his power and platform to increase possibilities for Black women, communicating not only to Black women and girls, but to the world that he saw talent, beauty, brilliance, and value in Black women. In a culture where Black women of all varieties are bombarded with images and messages that devalue and debase them, Prince's intentional investment in these women is significant. So despite mainstream attempts to evict these sisters from the temple of Prince Rogers Nelson, I want us to acknowledge them. I want us to make sure that we uplift their names, their faces, their presence, so that folks know Prince did not hate Black women. To the contrary, he loved us. Thank you very much.